says the U.S. military is ramping up its efforts to evacuate Americans and Afghans from Kabul. In a recent CBS News poll, 63% of people said they support removing troops from Afghanistan, but only 47% say they approve of how the situation has been handled. Now, the one and only Ed O'Keefe has been following this story and joins me now. Ed, good morning.
Good morning, Christina. With the situation in Afghanistan quickly becoming more dangerous, that poll shows that the president's overall approval rating is slipping as he's facing criticism here at home and abroad.
We are proving that we can move those thousands of people a day out of Kabul.
President Biden tried to ease concerns Sunday about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
There is no way to evacuate this many people without pain and loss of heartbreaking images you see on television. It's just a fact.
The president said the U.S. is now actively monitoring potential terrorist threats to Americans and Afghans as chaos unfolds in Kabul, with particular concern about ISIS-K, an ISIS affiliate that's an enemy of the Taliban based in Afghanistan.
We're under no illusions about the threat.
Mr. Biden continues to face a litany of criticism as the U.S. executes one of the most elaborate mass evacuations since World War II.
This is one of the biggest debacles that we have seen in the last several decades.
The White House is denying what we know is happening on the ground.
The president needs to step up and be the commander-in-chief.
According to a new CBS News poll, not only do the majority of Americans believe the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan has gone badly, but President Biden's overall approval rating has plunged 8 points in the last month, his lowest numbers yet. And the survey shows a majority of Americans no longer consider the president to be competent, focused, or effective in the job.
What would you say to those Americans who no longer believe that you're up to the job?
My job is to make judgments no one else can or will make. I made them. I'm convinced I'm absolutely correct in not deciding to send more young women and men to war for a war that, in fact, is no longer warranted. I think that history is going to record this was the logical, rational, and right decision to make.
Now, the president plans to hold a virtual meeting with the other leaders of G7 countries on Tuesday to discuss the chaos in Afghanistan, and he's scheduled to hold security meetings every day this week with his top national security and military aides to get a handle on the ongoing evacuation. Rafini, which I know you, more than most of us, have been tracking quite closely.
Well, you have as well, Ed, and I know you were there yesterday and you were able to ask President Biden about that CBS News polling. I think we've got a shot of it. Let's take a listen.
Because the United States is now negotiating with the Taliban over airport access and such, do you now trust them? And then a question on the public response. A new poll out today shows Americans wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, but they disapprove of the way you've handled it. Poll also found that, based in part on what's transpired in the last week, a majority of Americans, and forgive me, I'm just the messenger, no longer consider you to be competent, focused, or effective in the job.
I haven't seen that poll.
It's out there from CBS this morning. What would you say to those Americans who no longer believe that you're up to the job?
I had a basic decision to make. I either withdraw America from a 20-year war that, depending on whose analysis you accept, cost us $150 million a day for 20 years or $300 million a day for 20 years, who, and you know I carry this card with me every day, and who, in fact, where we lost 2,448 Americans dead and 20,722 wounded. Either increase the number of forces we keep there and keep that going, or I end the war.
Now, Ed, in addition to the polling you referenced in your exchange with the president, you know, it's funny, they almost have never seen the polling when it's bad news, but we'll go into that later. Another CBS News poll found 36% of Americans believe President Biden holds a lot of responsibility for the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. Only 25% attribute that to former President Trump. Can you give us some kind of context about how we got here and why the American public blames one over the other?
Well, I think it's a sign that the American public understands what's going on here, and that is that after 20 years, they clearly weren't able to defend their own country against the Taliban, and this thing rapidly deteriorated. I think, if anything, frankly, the White House would look at those numbers and breathe a sigh of relief that he may be getting a little more blame than his predecessor even though they argue that it was his predecessor that set this whole situation up to begin with. But at least the American public understands that it's the Afghan government, the Afghan military, that is chiefly responsible for the situation that's unfolded. And as the president has been saying for more than a week now, any withdrawal, no matter when it was going to happen, was going to be messy and hard, and that's what's underway right now. So, look, bad numbers for him in our poll, worse numbers in a similar survey by another news organization, all of it showing that the situation in Afghanistan, while the American public can kind of separate the two, in general appreciate and understand and support getting out, don't like the way it's been handled in the last 10 days, and all of it reflecting poorly on the president's overall performance and approval ratings, because you've got not only the situation in Afghanistan, but of course the Delta variant and the pandemic and how that has sort of been upended. A situation that to some extent is out of his control, but that critics have argued they could have been better prepared for and more vigilant about in the weeks leading up to the surge that has taken off now. So, look, this happens to every presidency. They hit a point where the uncontrollable occurs, and it's all about how they react to it. This White House is continuing to react to the evacuation, and as it's shown in his schedule this week, he is set to spend a considerable amount of time focused on this every single day this week.
Now, you and I have gone several rounds with this argument about whether or not, come the midterms, come the next election cycle, Americans tend to have a short memory on stuff like this, and whether or not you think it's going to impact him. Now, there's two issues. There's whether or not the actual policy is something people vote on, or whether or not the image of his competency, as it was closer to our CBS News poll, impacts him overall. What are your thoughts on that, and have they changed any in the past week?
We're already seeing Republican groups using the images, as you just said, the images of the chaos in Kabul in political advertising, especially in the digital space, and we'll likely continue to see that going into next year, because it helps make that broader competency, strong management counter-argument to the president, who ran on the idea that he knew how to do this and was going to avoid this kind of calamity. Republicans see that now, realize he's vulnerable, and will use it. And they'll use it just the same way that if you like your health care, you can keep it was used against Barack Obama when that pledge wasn't true. They'll use it against him the way Mission Accomplished was by George W. Bush, or when he said that the FEMA director, Michael Brown, was doing a heck of a job in the early days of the Katrina response. This happens, again, to presidents. How do they respond to the unexpected? How does that get used against them in the court of public opinion in an election season? This is early fodder for Republicans for elections that are still more than a year away, but in which perhaps they'll see some influence in a handful of special elections this fall, the California recall, maybe even the Virginia governor's race across the river, which are early test cases going into the midterms next year.
And how is the White House responding to the evacuation effort in Kabul this morning? Have we heard anything else from the White House? I've heard from people on the ground. Most of them still cannot get to the airport, but I do know of at least one woman who is now home in California, and we're hoping there's some progress being made. But from a policy standpoint, what are you hearing?
From a policy standpoint and from a progress standpoint, the White House is sharing just raw numbers. So let me just read you these raw numbers. They say that from 3 a.m. Eastern on Sunday to 3 a.m. Eastern this morning, 28 U.S. military flights evacuated approximately 10,400 people from Kabul, and that an additional 61 coalition aircraft, so that's NATO, Germany, the UK, France, other countries, evacuated another 5,900 people. And since August 14th, when things really started to go south, the U.S. has evacuated 37,000 people. They don't specify whether they're Americans, whether they're Afghans, whether they're, from NATO countries. They just say people. We've asked, can you break out the people, since you estimated about 15 to 20,000 Americans were still in the country? How are we doing on getting them out, since that's the primary mission? White House says they have nothing to offer. So they're going to continue to pump out these numbers, which after a few days will get confusing, to try to muddy the water and say, oh, look, like the numbers keep improving. They're still getting people out. But remember, the goal was to have 5,000 out a day. Yesterday, or in the 24-hour span, I guess they doubled that. But where's the end game, and how many people total are we working with here to get out? They still won't tell us, which, again, allows them to not have to be set to a goalpost in the near future if they don't know and they won't share the specific number that may be out there. So in other words, this is how they're explaining it, defending it, spinning it this morning, and that they will continue to do by saying, look, there's been progress. Thank God it's been safe. Save for that gunfight outside the airport this morning with German troops and Afghans. And as long as that continues, I think the White House is going to see it as a sustainable situation that they'll continue to play out.
And they also won't tell us how many American citizens have notified them saying they want to leave the country, because if that's a number we had, that's a number we could compare to the ones you just read at the end of this mission. Now, speaking of the end of this mission, President Biden says the U.S. might stay beyond August 31st, but over the weekend, a Taliban spokesman said to Sky News that staying past the declared deadline would be crossing a red line. What more do we know about the Biden administration's plans should American troops decide they want to or need to stay past August 1st, either to get Americans out or to get Afghan allies out of the country?
That's why the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken yesterday wouldn't say whether the plan is to stay beyond August 31st, why the president wouldn't entirely explicitly commit to that, although he said, look, any American who wants to get out will get out. Didn't put a date on it. I think the goal here certainly is to get it done before the 31st so that that debate was for naught. But let's see, as we get closer to that next week, what they plan to do.
Ed O'Keefe from the White House, thank you so much.
You having fun up there?
It's a pretty great crew up here. You should come join us.
Well, one day. You're looking good. You know, folks, we used to work together. Look at her now.
I was your first television producer, and now you're a White House correspondent. So
worked out for both of us. Have a good one.
Thank you, Ed.